let's talk about water. We all rely on it, obviously, right?
Yeah.
But how far back do you think the really engineered stuff goes? Not just like fetching buckets from a river, but complex systems, indoor plumbing maybe, citywide drainage, controlling floods or getting water uphill.
Yeah. What comes to mind first?
Are we talking Rome? Maybe Greece?
You might think so.
But what if I told you some of these ideas, in surprisingly sophisticated forms, existed thousands of years earlier, like way back in the Bronze Age or even before that?
That's exactly it. It's one of the remarkable revelations when you look closely at the earliest complex societies. Managing water wasn't just like a side project.
Oh, it sounds fundamental.
It was absolutely central to their ability to cluster large populations, grow surplus food, and really build the foundations of what we recognize as civilization.
Right.
And the engineering solutions they devised, often tailored to highly specific environments. It represents incredible human ingenuity.
And that's what we're unpacking today, right? We're diving deep into the sources you've shared on ancient water engineering.
Exactly.
And forget the dry academic papers. We've really tried to pull out the truly fascinating nuggets, the surprising facts, the ingenious techniques, the environmental challenges they were grappling with that honestly still resonate today.
They really do.
So our mission is to understand how some of the very first great civilizations managed water, the lifeblood of their societies. We'll be comparing their innovations, the problems they solved, and their kind of lasting achievements across different corners of the ancient world.
Yeah, and we'll be looking at some key examples. We've got the early city-states of Mesopotamia, like Uruk, famous for their massive irrigation. Then there's the Indus Valley civilization, particularly Mohenjo-Daro, meticulously planned cities that boasted, astonishing sanitation for the time.
Astonishing is the word.
And ancient Egypt, of course, with its unique relationship with the predictable Nile, will focus on places like Thebes. And then we'll journey over to the Andes, to those challenging high-altitude landscapes, looking at pre-Columbian cultures like Tiwanaku and the Inca, which we see so vividly at Machu Picchu.
Wow, okay, quite a tour.
It is. And our stack of sources covers everything, really. Sprawling canal networks, reservoirs, groundbreaking sewer systems, just the sheer human effort involved.
So why should you, listening right now, care about how people moved water around thousands of years ago?
It's a fair question.
Well, because understanding how these ancient peoples faced these fundamental environmental challenges, with the tools they had, it can offer these incredible aha moments about resilience, about sustainable design and human innovation that are just profoundly relevant today. So prepare for some facts that might make you rethink what was possible back then.
Definitely.
Okay, let's start our journey in the land often called the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia.
Right, Mesopotamia. Let's set the scene. We're talking about the region primarily defined by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
The land between rivers.
Exactly, the land between rivers. But here's the paradox. Away from the immediate riverbanks, it's actually a pretty harsh, arid environment. Rainfall is scarce, unpredictable.
Right.
And while the rivers provide water, their floods, especially the Tigris, could be erratic and, frankly, destructive.
So not like the predictable Nile we'll get to later.
Not at all. So for settled agriculture and, urban life to thrive here, they absolutely had to control and redirect these powerful, sometimes really capricious water sources, and on a massive scale.
And this challenge, it just pushed them to innovate, right?
Yeah.
Right from the start of urbanism.
Yeah, from the get-go.
We're talking cities like Uruk, one of the largest Sumerian city-states, flourishing way back in the 4th millennium BC. Their approach to water management, it sounds like it was just foundational to them becoming one of the first complex urban societies.
Precisely. The absolute bedrock of Sumerian civilization in this environment was large-scale irrigation. Their efforts weren't just, a few local ditches.
Yeah.
These were immense regional undertakings. They built extensive networks of canals to harness and channel the floodwaters, moving them away from potentially destructive courses and out towards the fields.
Okay.
And along the riverbanks, they constructed substantial earthen levees or dikes, to contain the rivers and basically direct where and when the water flowed during the seasonal floods.
And the scale of this, modern archaeology really brings this home, doesn't it?
It does. Studies in the Eridu and Uruk region, for instance, they've mapped over 200 main canals built by the Sumerians.
200.
Yeah, and some of these primary channels stretched up to 9 kilometers. That's over 5 miles long.
Wow.
And branching off these main arteries were, get this, more than 4,000 smaller branch canals, like capillaries really, distributing water from the Euphrates across this vast area. It's estimated they served around 700 individual farms just in that one locale.
Incredible. And it was mostly gravity doing the work.
Primarily, yeah. It was a gravity-fed system. They'd strategically make these deliberate breaches in the high riverbanks at certain points. It's a technique called creating crevasse splays. Basically, it naturally directs the sediment-rich floodwaters into designed basin areas and then into this extensive network of distribution canals. The natural slope of the land, which is gentle away from the rivers, it helped facilitate this gravity flow.
But managing a system this vast, built mostly out of earth, that must have been incredibly hard work. It wasn't just set it and forget it.
Oh, far from it. The sources really emphasize the constant, just back-breaking labor required.
I bet.
These canals carrying all that silt-laden water, they'd rapidly silt up, reducing the flow. Dikes needed constant monitoring, constant repair, especially during flood season.
Right.
This wasn't something individual farmers could manage on their own. It demanded sophisticated organization, often handled by powerful institutions like the temples or the burgeoning state authorities.
Okay, so it's tied into governance right from the start.
Absolutely. The necessity of collective maintenance and, equitable water distribution for this shared vital resource meant water management was deeply integrated with governance and law.
And we actually see that reflected in their legal codes, don't we? Like Hammurabi's code.
We do. Later Mesopotamian law codes, Hammurabi's is the most famous. Though it's Babylonian, it reflects these long-standing practices. They contain numerous stipulations specifically about water management.
Like what?
Laws dictating who's responsible for maintaining sections of canals, penalties for neglecting dikes if that floods your neighbor's fields, rules against messing with someone else's water access.
Right.
This isn't just engineering, it's socio-engineering. The technical system relies entirely on strong social and legal frameworks to even function.
Okay, so they had the infrastructure for the floods getting water out to the fields. But what about the dry season? When the rivers were low and gravity wasn't enough?
Yeah, good point. That required actually lifting water from the lower channels up to fields or higher distribution points.
Okay.
It wasn't on the scale of the main canals, obviously, but for localized irrigation or, just supplementing the supply during dry periods, they used manual methods.
Like the shadowy.
Exactly. The sources describe the use of shadows, that classic sweep pole, with bucket and a counterweight on one end. It allowed a single person to lift relatively large volumes of water with much less effort.
Simple but effective.
Very. And simple bucket hoists pulled over canal walls were also used. Basic tech, yes, but essential for cultivating year-round.
And the payoff for all this labor and organization, what did it get them?
Immense payoff. These systems transformed what would otherwise be pretty marginal land into highly fertile plains, capable of supporting large urban populations.
Right.
The wealth generated by this irrigated agriculture, it fueled the growth of cities like Uruk, Kish, Lagash, Umma. It allowed for specialization, trade, the development of complex societal structures, writing, administration, monumental architecture. It really was the foundation of their civilization.
Okay, now let's shift focus a bit. From the vast agricultural landscape to what was happening inside those cities. Was there urban water management as large-scale or complex as the irrigation?
Generally, no, not in the same way. You don't see, citywide aqueducts bringing fresh water into the city in the early period like you might picture later in Rome.
Okay.
Water was typically drawn directly from nearby canals or rivers, or maybe from wells within the city, however. They were remarkably pioneering in one crucial area: urban sanitation.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because sanitation feels like a much more, modern concern.
Exactly. And this is one of those surprising nuggets from the sources. Mesopotamia was actually using ceramic sewer pipes incredibly early.
How early?
Archaeological digs at sites like Nippur and Eshnunna have uncovered baked clay pipes used for draining wastewater and rainwater from areas like temple precincts dating back as early as 4000 BCE.
4000 BCE. Clay pipes for drainage.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thousands of years before many other cultures even considered specialized drainage within cities.
And what about in Uruk itself? Did they have a similar thing?
At Uruk, yeah, archaeologists have found evidence of brick-lined latrines dating back to roughly 3200 BCE.
Latrines, like toilets.
Essentially, yeah. Early forms of toilets, often connected to basic drainage channels. Think of them as like predecessors to flush toilets, though they likely required manual flushing or emptying, directing waste away from the occupied areas.
So they had drains and dedicated toilet areas in some important places. Where did these drainage channels actually go?
Well, they would likely empty into cesspits, outside the immediate area, or in some cases, they might flow towards nearby rivers or canals. It wasn't a closed, comprehensive system like modern sewers.
Right.
But it definitely shows a deliberate effort to remove waste and runoff from important urban spaces. The cities also used baked clay or brick-lined gutters along streets to manage stormwater runoff during those infrequent but sometimes heavy rains.
And the source is mentioned in contrast with later cultures about public baths.
Yeah, that's interesting. Unlike the huge public bath complexes we see later in Rome or even the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia seems to have had limited or maybe no large public baths. Personal bathing likely happened in simpler washrooms inside private houses, often just a corner with a sloped floor designed to drain water out or maybe into a small pit.
Okay. So urban water supply wasn't a massive engineered system, but the focus was clearly on removing wastewater and controlling runoff from key areas like temples and streets. What does all this, the huge canals and the early urban drains, tell us about their technological and planning skills?
Well, it demonstrates a pretty sophisticated, practical understanding of hydrology. They knew how water moved, how to channel it, how to manage gradients, even if they didn't have like a formal scientific theory for it.
Right, empirical knowledge.
Exactly. And on the planning side, the sheer coordination required for those regional irrigation networks is just immense. The sources suggest a kind of hierarchical structure, maybe hinting at something like regional water departments. Officials tasked with overseeing construction, maintenance, maybe even measuring water levels to allocate irrigation times to different communities or farms.
Which highlights that their engineering wasn't just about building stuff, it was about building and managing a complex socio-technical system.
Precisely. The technology itself, earthen canals, gravity, manual lifts like the shadowy might seem straightforward compared to later Roman aqueducts or whatever, but the complexity lay in the socio-engineering. Organizing the labor of thousands, resolving disputes over water rights, maintaining the system across, potentially, political boundaries. It required immense administrative capacity and social cohesion.
Which brings us to a really important question. The long-term sustainability of this system. You hinted earlier, it wasn't all positive.
That's where the fascinating and, I guess, cautionary insight lies. These massive irrigation efforts, while incredibly successful in the short to medium term, they led to significant long-term environmental problems. The biggest issue was soil salinization.
Salinization. How did that happen?
It's a combination of things. Constant flooding, high evaporation rates in that arid climate, and often inadequate drainage meant that salts, which are naturally present in the soil and the river water, didn't get properly flushed away. Instead, as the water evaporated from the surface of the fields, the salts were just left behind, gradually accumulating in the topsoil.
And how did that impact their farming?
It gradually reduced the fertility of the land. Over centuries, yields declined. The sources actually document this impact indirectly by showing a shift in the main crops they grew.
How so?
Wheat, which is less tolerant of high salt levels, became harder and harder to grow. So farmers were increasingly forced to switch to barley, which can handle higher salinity much better. This widespread shift is seen by scholars as a direct consequence of the environmental degradation caused by their own irrigation methods.
Wow. So their own success, in a way, created a long-term problem that undermined their agricultural base.
Yeah, essentially. While, social and political factors were definitely also at play, scholars strongly suggest that rising soil salinity and also the natural shifting of the Euphrates River's course over millennia, which made some canals useless, contributed significantly to the economic weakening and eventual decline of some of the key Sumerian city-states, including Uruk.
It's a powerful lesson, isn't it?
Yeah.
Even groundbreaking engineering can have these unintended environmental consequences that unfold over huge timescales.
Absolutely.
But despite this long-term challenge, the civilization didn't just, collapse overnight.
No, not at all. Mesopotamian civilization in various forms persisted for over 3,000 years. They adapted, shifted centers of power, partly in response to these environmental pressures. The system, with its strengths and its inherent long-term weaknesses, sustained a vibrant civilization for a very, very long time, demonstrating remarkable resilience in many ways.
So, connecting this back to you listening, think about some of the massive water projects in the world today. Huge dams, giant irrigation schemes in arid regions. We still grapple with environmental impacts, right? like groundwater depletion or the very same salinization that affected Mesopotamia, and the need for constant maintenance and governance.
Still huge issues.
How does seeing the roots of these challenges, faced by engineers thousands of years ago with entirely different tools, change your perspective on our modern water issues? Which kind of puts our own engineering decisions in this long historical context, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Now let's shift our gaze eastwards, over to the Indus Valley civilization, flourishing roughly from 2600 to 1900 BCE. Their approach to water management, especially within their large urban centers like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, represents a different but equally impressive set of priorities and technological achievements.
Right, the Indus cities, they're famous for those highly planned grid layouts. How did water engineering fit into that whole urban vision?
It was absolutely integral. The sources highlight their remarkably advanced water management, and the most striking aspect really is their urban sanitation. This wasn't an afterthought. It was built into the very fabric of the cities, right from the ground up.
Yeah.
Nearly every house in major centers like Mohenjo-Daro had a dedicated bathing room or washroom. These rooms were often located near the street and built with carefully laid water-resistant baked bricks to contain the water.
Okay, dedicated bathing rooms.
Yeah.
And the dirty water from these baths went where?
This is where their true innovation shines. The houses were connected to covered underground drains running along the streets. Wastewater from the bathing rooms and potentially other household waste liquids was funneled directly into these sophisticated sewers.
So these weren't just open ditches like you might see elsewhere at the time. They were actual buried, constructed pipes or channels.
Precisely. The sources describe these street drains as constructed with precisely laid baked bricks, often corbelled, where bricks are stepped inward to form an arched or triangular channel, then covered with more bricks or stone slabs.
Wow.
And crucially, they incorporated features for maintenance. Think about this. Inspection holes at intervals, and settling sumps or traps at the base of house connections to catch solid debris and prevent blockages in the main sewer line. This indicates a real practical understanding of how to keep a complex system running.
Inspection holes and sediment traps.
Yeah.
That's incredible foresight. And it gets even more impressive, doesn't it, with the multi-story houses?
Yes. It's one of the most astonishing facts about Mohenjo-Daro, the evidence for multi-story houses having indoor plumbing. Archaeologists have found clay pipes or carefully constructed brick chutes leading from where second-floor bathrooms would have been down to connect with the street-level drains below.
Indoor plumbing covered engineered sewers, inspection holes, waste traps in the Bronze Age.
Yeah. It's truly mind-blowing. The sources confidently state that this integrated system, household bathing rooms, connected to a citywide network of covered underground drains, constitutes the world's earliest known urban sanitation system of this scale and sophistication.
Nothing like it until Rome, basically.
Pretty much. It wasn't matched until the extensive sewer systems of the Roman Empire nearly 2,000 years later. The core insight here is that these ancient urban planners understood the fundamental importance of separating waste from living spaces for public health, and they had the organizational capacity to build it citywide.
That level of infrastructure implies a real priority on hygiene and public health, which is just remarkable for the time.
It really does. While we can't know their exact medical theories, the consistent implementation of these features across different cities suggests a standardized approach and a recognition of the need to manage waste for the well-being of the urban population. And those settling pits also point to a practical knowledge of hydraulics, how to manage solids in a liquid waste system.
So where did they get their fresh water supply for all these houses and baths? Did they have aqueducts too?
No, not large-scale aqueducts like Rome. They primarily relied on a dense network of wells within the cities. Mohenjo-Daro, for example, is estimated to have had over 700 wells.
700 wells in one city.
Yeah, many of them substantial brick-lined structures providing a reliable source of fresh water accessible to most residents. These wells were carefully constructed, often using wedge-shaped bricks to form a strong, circular shaft.
They also had larger public water features, right? Like the Great Bath.
Yes, the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro is probably the most famous example. This was a large public brick tank, roughly 12 meters by 7 meters, and about 2.4 meters deep.
Pretty big.
Oh, yeah. Its walls were carefully constructed with baked bricks and critically sealed with a layer of natural bitumen asphalt, essentially to make it watertight.
Which is an impressive feat of engineering for such a large structure back then.
Absolutely. It had steps leading down, a clear drain outlet connected to the city's main drainage system, allowing it to be filled and emptied. It might have been used for ritual purposes, maybe public bathing. We're not entirely sure.
And they manage rainwater as well.
Yeah.
You mentioned the grid layout that can cause flooding issues.
Definitely. The street drains were multi-purpose. They collected stormwater runoff from the grid-patterned streets and directed it away from the dense urban blocks, preventing flooding. And beyond the immediate cities, some settlements also practiced large-scale water storage.
Like reservoirs.
Exactly. The city of De Oliveira, for instance, located in a more arid region, built massive rock-cut reservoirs, dams, and stone-lined tanks to capture and store the seasonal monsoon runoff. This rainwater harvesting was crucial for buffering their water supply through the long dry season.
So compared to Mesopotamia's massive focus on agricultural irrigation, the Indus priority seems different.
Yes, while they did practice surrounding canal irrigation and used embankments to manage seasonal river floods for agriculture, the sources really emphasize that the most striking and sophisticated water engineering of the Indus civilization was within their urban centers. The focus and the major investment were clearly on providing clean water access and, crucially, removing waste to maintain a healthy urban environment.
This level of planning and standardization across multiple cities, it's just remarkable.
It really is. The evidence of precise drain gradients, the use of standardized brick sizes, the consistent layout facilitating drainage, it all points to a high degree of centralized planning and engineering oversight. The uniformity of plumbing features found in widely separated cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa suggests not only standardized practices, but possibly a strong municipal authority that governed and maintained these complex urban systems.
Okay, let's compare the scale and complexity here to Mesopotamia again.
Right. The scale of Indus water management was primarily urban, serving tens of thousands of people within the city limits, which might span dozens or hundreds of hectares. While their regional agricultural infrastructure existed, it wasn't on that same vast valley-wide scale as Mesopotamia's irrigation.
But the city stuff was more advanced.
Arguably, yes. In terms of urban engineering complexity, the Indus was probably more advanced. Their integrated network of covered house drains and street sewers was significantly more intricate and widespread than anything seen in Mesopotamia or Egypt at this time. They mastered gravity flow for waste removal on an urban scale. Now, there's no evidence that they used pumps. They relied on wells and fetching water for supply, but their drainage was revolutionary.
What about sustainability and the legacy? Did the system last?
Well, the use of durable baked bricks definitely contributed to their longevity. I mean, many of these structures are still visible today, thousands of years later. The practical design, including features for maintenance like those inspection holes, indicates they planned for the long-term functioning of the system. And waste removed from the city was likely used as fertilizer in surrounding fields, a kind of practical recycling.
And like Mesopotamia, the civilization eventually declined. Was it an engineering failure this time?
The consensus is probably not. The decline of the Indus civilization around 1900 BCE was more likely due to broader environmental factors, things like shifts in monsoon patterns causing droughts, or perhaps changes in the courses of the Indus River and its tributaries. The urban water infrastructure itself, while obviously needing maintenance, appears to have been pretty robust and functional for centuries.
So their legacy is really about that groundbreaking urban sanitation.
Absolutely. They set a precedent for urban hygiene and integrated plumbing that was just far ahead of its time. Their engineering achievements in creating livable, planned, and relatively healthy cities with sophisticated water and waste management remain one of the most significant contributions of the Bronze Age.
Connecting this back to you again.
Yeah.
Imagine stepping into one of these ancient cities and seeing indoor plumbing and covered sewers. It completely flips the common image of ancient life for most people, doesn't it?
It really does.
What stands out to you about this level of public health infrastructure being prioritized so early in human history? It makes you think about the fundamental building blocks of urban life, maybe in a different way.
It truly challenges our assumptions. Now let's move westwards to ancient Egypt, a civilization whose relationship with water was fundamentally different from Mesopotamia or the Indus. It was defined almost entirely by one factor: the unique and highly predictable annual inundation, the flooding of the Nile River.
Predictability. That sounds like a huge advantage compared to the erratic rivers of Mesopotamia you mentioned.
Oh, it was a game changer. The Egyptians didn't have to constantly battle capricious floods. They could anticipate and actually work with the rhythm of the Nile's annual rise, the Akhet season. Their entire agricultural and social system was built around harnessing this predictable cycle, largely through something called basin irrigation.
Basin irrigation, okay.
And efforts to organize this valley-wide system were unified remarkably early, attributed to figures like King Menes way back, maybe 3000 BCE.
So how did this basin irrigation system actually work?
The core technique involved dividing the floodplain into large, rectangular earthen basins using dikes or levees built parallel and perpendicular to the river.
Okay, like big fields enclosed by banks.
Exactly. When the Nile began its predictable annual flood, usually starting around July, they would channel the rising waters through feeder canals into these prepared basins. The water would then sit in the basins for several weeks, maybe 40 days or so.
Doing what?
Saturating the soil, obviously, but crucially, also depositing a fresh layer of nutrient-rich silt carried all the way from the upstream mountains in Ethiopia.
So they weren't just watering the land, they were naturally fertilizing it every single year.
Exactly. That's the key difference. After the water had done its work, soaking in and leaving that rich silt, they would open sluice gates on the dikes to drain the excess water back to the river, or maybe into lower-lying basins further away. This controlled impounding and release of the floodwaters allowed them to cultivate land far beyond the immediate riverbanks, using the full width of the floodplain where possible.
The scale must have been enormous, running the whole length of the Nile Valley.
It was immense. By the New Kingdom period, sources estimate that around 800,000 hectares, that's nearly 2 million acres, were cultivated using this basin irrigation system. Egyptian records, papyri detailing land and water rights, and those vibrant tomb scenes, like the ones at Thebes, they visually depict this dense network of canals, dikes, and basins supporting their agriculture.
Managing a system that big, spanning the entire valley, that must have required a pretty sophisticated government structure.
Absolutely. It necessitated a complex, centralized bureaucracy. Officials at various levels, from local village headmen up to regional governors, the nomarchs, and high-ranking overseers, they were responsible for maintaining the dikes and canals, ensuring they were clear of silt, and regulating water usage and access.
Critical stuff.
Yeah, critical to prevent disputes and just make sure the system functioned for everyone.
Yeah.
The administration of the flood and the land was deeply intertwined with the power of the state, ultimately led by the pharaoh.
And like Mesopotamia, water management even found its way into their moral or legal framework.
Yeah.
You mentioned those confessions.
Yes, it was deeply embedded in their societal norms and ethics. Egyptian law and wisdom texts really frowned upon damaging irrigation works or interfering with a neighbor's access to water.
Makes sense.
And famously in the Book of the Dead, the negative confessions, that list of sins the deceased denies committing to the gods to get into the afterlife, they include specific vows like, I have not diverted water in its channels, or I have not blocked the water of a canal. It highlights this strong administrative and ethical system designed to protect the shared water resource and prevent conflict over its use.
One key aspect of their sustainability seems to be completely natural, unlike Mesopotamia's salinization problem. You touched on the silt.
Yes, this is a crucial contrast, and it's fascinating. The Nile's annual flood naturally provided two key things that prevented the Mesopotamian issue. First, it periodically leached any accumulated salts from the soil, basically washing them away.
Okay.
And second, it continuously replenished the soil with that fresh, nutrient-rich silt. This meant Egyptian agriculture didn't face that long-term salinization crisis that plagued Mesopotamia. It was an inherently sustainable environmental partnership, you could say, between human engineering and the natural rhythm of the river. And it lasted for roughly 3 millennia.
Amazing. How did cities like Thebes get water for daily use outside the flood season?
Well, urban centers were typically located right alongside the main Nile channel or connected via canals that held water year-round. Daily water was primarily just fetched directly from the river or these permanent canals in pottery jars and carried to homes and businesses.
No, mostly manual labor.
Mostly. While there's evidence of wells in some settlements, the high water table along the Nile often made direct river access the easiest option for most people.
Did they have ways to lift water for smaller-scale irrigation or other needs like gardens?
Yes, a key technological development that became widespread was the shadowy, which we mentioned earlier. It appears in Egypt around the 2nd millennium BC.
Right, the lever thing.
That simple lever-based device with a bucket counterbalanced by a weight on a pivoted pole. It was incredibly effective for lifting water from the river or a lower canal up to a higher level, like a garden plot, a small field, or maybe filling a channel for a cistern. Tomb art from sites like Thebes and places like the tomb of Neferhotep vividly depicts workers using shadows to water small gardens or fields. It shows its importance in supplementing the main basin system.
And how did they predict the flood? Was it just guesswork based on the season?
Oh, far from it. They developed sophisticated environmental monitoring tools called nilometers.
Kilometers.
Yeah. These were structures, often stone wells or stairways built right into the riverbank, with gauge markings on the walls. There are examples at sites like Thebes, Karnak, and Memphis. Priests and scribes would carefully monitor the water levels in these nilometers throughout the year, especially as the flood season approached. This allowed them to predict the flood's height and volume with remarkable accuracy.
And why was predicting the flood height so important? Taxes.
Partially, yes. It was vital for planning the whole agricultural season, determining how much land could be irrigated, what crops to plant where, and yes, for administrative purposes like assessing taxes, which were often based on the expected harvest yield predicted by the flood height. It tied environmental monitoring directly to economic and governmental function.
Did they build any larger, more monumental water structures within the cities or temples? You mentioned cisterns.
Yes. Large cisterns or sacred lakes were significant features, particularly within temple complexes. The massive sacred lake at the Temple of Karnak in Thebes is a prime example.
I think I've seen pictures of that. Huge.
It's vast, a rectangular basin, stone-lined, fed by groundwater. It served a practical purpose as a reservoir, but it was also used for ritual purification ceremonies and reenactments of the primeval waters from their creation myths. It shows the integration of water management with their religious and cultural life.
Okay, let's loop back to urban drainage and sanitation within Egyptian cities. How did that compare to the Indus Valley's sophisticated system?
Right, this raises a key point of contrast. While the Egyptians were absolute masters of large-scale agricultural water management, their urban sanitation was generally much less developed than what we saw in the Indus.
But there were some early examples.
We do see early examples of specialized drainage, particularly in monumental architecture. The Pyramid of Sihor, dating to around 2400 BCE in Abusir, actually incorporated copper pipes to drain rainwater runoff from its mortuary temple complex.
Copper pipes. In a pyramid complex.
Yeah.
That's pretty specific.
It is. One of the earliest known uses of metal piping in architecture, specifically for drainage, designed to protect the valuable stone structures.
Okay. What about in people's homes?
In wealthier homes, particularly from later periods like the New Kingdom, we see this at Amarna. And in some Theban houses, archaeologists have found evidence of rudimentary bathrooms. Maybe plastered basins, sloped floors leading to drain openings, and sometimes simple seated toilets.
What were those like?
Essentially wooden seats over a shaft, or maybe a pottery receptacle that would need to be manually emptied. There are also some reports of palace complexes having more elaborate facilities, potentially including some form of flush mechanism, maybe similar to those found in Minoan palaces on Crete.
But this wasn't a citywide network connecting everyone.
No, and that's the important distinction from the Indus Valley. Ancient Egyptian cities, by and large, did not possess extensive, integrated sewer networks connecting individual homes to underground mains. Waste disposal was often much more informal.
So.
Household waste might be collected for use as fertilizer outside the city, or sometimes just discarded in alleyways to be hopefully washed away by rare rainstorms or removed manually. The very arid climate also reduced the need for the kind of heavy stormwater drainage seen in wetter regions like the Indus Valley. The primary focus, the main investment in Egyptian water engineering, was always on the predictable, life-giving Nile flood and managing it for agriculture across the entire valley.
Okay, so to summarize the scale and complexity for Egypt.
Scale. Immense for the basin irrigation system, a single, centrally administered system spanning over 1,000 kilometers of the Nile Valley, irrigating hundreds of thousands of hectares. Complexity. High in terms of social and governmental coordination needed to manage this vast valley-wide system based on that natural flood pulse.
But the tech itself was simpler.
Relatively, yes. The technology, earthworks, simple gates, manual lifts like the shadowy, was pretty low-tech compared to later developments, but incredibly effective when applied systematically. Urban water management, beyond just drawing from the river and some localized drainage or toilets in elite homes, was comparatively modest in its engineering complexity compared to the Indus's citywide networks.
And its sustainability and legacy. Sounds pretty good on the sustainability front.
Remarkably high sustainability. The basin irrigation system, thanks to the Nile's natural annual renewal of soil fertility and the salt leaching, sustained continuous high-yield agriculture for an astounding 3,000 years. It was really a model of working with nature's rhythms.
Stable as long as the floods came.
Exactly. The system was inherently stable as long as the floods were consistent. The society developed resilience against periods of irregular floods through strong central administration, including things like state granaries to mitigate famine risk.
And the environmental impact seems much lower compared to Mesopotamia's salinization.
Yes, the minimal salinization was a key advantage. The primary environmental risk was just dependence on the flood itself. Periods of unusually low floods, while managed through state granaries, could still lead to hardship and famine. It shows that even a system finely tuned to nature is vulnerable to climatic extremes.
What's the enduring legacy of this Egyptian approach? What did they pass on?
Well, their basin irrigation techniques and the whole concept of harnessing seasonal floods through controlled basins were adopted and adapted by later cultures that controlled Egypt, including the Greeks and Romans. The shadowy spread widely across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia as a fundamental water-lifting device. And the model of a highly organized, state-managed water system for an entire large region became a textbook example for what scholars sometimes call hydraulic civilizations. It shows how large-scale water control can shape the very structure of a society and its governance.
Connecting this back to you again. It's truly fascinating how dependent and almost harmoniously intertwined Egyptian civilization was with the natural cycle of the Nile. Their engineering wasn't really about dominating the river, but about working with its predictable pulse.
A different philosophy, almost.
How does this approach, focusing on harnessing natural cycles, compare to our modern tendency to build massive structures to sort of control nature completely? And what lessons might it hold for building more resilient systems today? It's definitely something to ponder.
Absolutely. Okay, from the great river valleys of the Old World, let's traverse continents and altitudes to the ancient Andes of South America. Here, civilizations faced mountainous terrain, high plateaus, extreme altitude, variable climates. It forced entirely different yet equally remarkable water engineering innovations.
This is tough.
Yeah. Well, look at Tiwanaku, high on the Bolivian Altiplano near Lake Titicaca, and the Inca, focusing on their achievements exemplified by Machu Picchu. These represent different eras and scales of mastery.
These environments sound incredibly challenging for farming and cities compared to the flat river valleys we've been talking about. Let's start with Tiwanaku. Flourishing from around 500 to 1000 AD. What were the specific environmental hurdles they faced up there at 2,800 meters? That's about 12,500 feet.
Tiwanaku faced a brutal combination of challenges. You've got marked seasonal variation, distinct wet and dry periods, potential risks of both drought and floods, and most uniquely consistent, damaging nightly frosts at that high altitude, even during the growing season.
Nightly frosts, wow. Conventional farming sounds almost impossible.
Extremely difficult, if not impossible, on a large scale there.
So how did they manage to feed a sizable population in such a place? What was their trick?
Their ingenious core innovation was the development of extensive raised fields, known locally as sucacuelo.
Sucacuelo, okay.
These were large, elevated planting platforms, typically between 10 and 20 meters wide, sometimes extending for hundreds of meters in length, and they were separated by parallel canals filled with water.
Raised beds with canals in between.
And the scale. The scale of these engineered landscapes was vast, covering an estimated 130 square kilometers. That's about 50 square miles in the region surrounding the city. A massive landscape transformation.
Okay, what was the key purpose of these canals and raised beds? It wasn't just irrigation, was it?
No, this is where the deep ecological and engineering insight comes in. The canals served multiple interconnected functions. Yes, they provided moisture to the crops on the raised beds through capillary action.
Right.
They were also used for raising fish and aquatic plants, adding protein and nutrients to their diet. But the truly ingenious and crucial function at this altitude was temperature moderation.
Temperature moderation. How did water help with frost? That sounds counterintuitive.
Well, think about it. During the day, the water in the canals absorbed solar radiation, storing heat.
Oh.
At night, as the air temperature plummeted, the water in the canals would slowly radiate that absorbed heat upwards. This created a warmer microclimate layer just above the surface of the raised fields.
It's like a little thermal blanket.
Exactly. This subtle warmth was often just enough to keep the plants on the beds from freezing during the nightly frosts that would just devastate crops planted on flat, dry ground nearby. The core insight here is using water's thermal properties as a shield against environmental extremes.
That's a remarkable example of ecological engineering. And it actually worked.
Dramatically so. Experimental replications of these raised fields in the 1980s and 90s have shown their incredible effectiveness. They consistently produce significantly higher yields compared to modern conventional farming methods in the area.
Wow.
And crucially, they offer exceptional resilience against frost. There's a well-documented example from a severe freeze back in 1988. Nearby conventional potato fields suffered 70–90% crop loss.
Devastating.
Yeah, while the crops on the experimental raised fields experienced only about 10% loss. Plus, they used the nutrient-rich sludge dredged from the canals as fertilizer for the beds, completing this really sustainable cycle.
Amazing. Beyond this agricultural innovation, what about water management within the city of Tiwanaku itself? Do they have anything like sewers?
Surprisingly, yes. For a pre-Columbian civilization, the city of Tiwanaku also had a sophisticated urban water and wastewater management system. Archaeological investigations have uncovered a network of underground stone drains forming a comprehensive sewer system.
Stone sewers.
Yeah. These conduits were built with finely fitted stone blocks and laid with precise gradients to ensure that wastewater and stormwater flowed away from key urban areas.
So kind of like the Indus system, but using stone because that's what they had in the Andes.
Exactly. Stone was the primary material. The sources mention researchers like Alan Kalata describing these as clear evidence of a running sewer system. It demonstrates a high level of urban planning and sanitation concern, really unique in the pre-Columbian Americas at that time. They even found a large stone-lined perimeter drain surrounding the main ceremonial core of the city, designed to intercept runoff from the surrounding slopes and prevent flooding of important structures during intense rains.
And their understanding of water flow. It seems like it went beyond just making it go downhill.
It really seems they possessed a sophisticated, practical understanding of hydraulics. The design of their canals, including features like carefully shaped channels and weirs, suggests they could manage water velocity to prevent erosion. And remarkably, potentially even control the hydraulic jump.
The hydraulic jump, what's that?
It's that turbulent phenomenon where fast-moving water in an open channel abruptly slows down and increases in depth. Controlling it implies a deep empirical knowledge of fluid dynamics, even without, the modern scientific framework.
That's impressive. Did they also store water for the dry seasons?
Yes, they built reservoirs and terraces on surrounding hillsides to capture spring water and rainwater, storing it for use during the dry season. They also created these sunken, bowl-shaped depressions called cochas to collect and retain water and moisture in the landscape.
So Tiwanaku developed this incredibly integrated system, blending large-scale, climate-resilient agriculture with urban plumbing and regional water storage.
Exactly. It was a synthesis of needs from feeding the population to keeping the city functional and managing those unpredictable climate factors like frost and drought. The scale was regional for the agriculture, covering hundreds of square kilometers, and urban for the plumbing. The complexity was very high, combining hydraulic engineering with ecological principles in a way that was just uniquely suited to their challenging environment.
But this civilization also eventually declined, right? Around 1000 AD. Was their water system part of that story?
Tiwanaku peaked and declined around 1100 AD. While multiple factors were likely involved, paleoclimate data strongly suggests a sustained multi-decade drought severely impacted the Lake Titicaca region.
A mega drought.
Pretty much. This unprecedented drought would have drastically lowered the lake level and reduced the flow from the springs that fed those raised field canals, making the whole system unsustainable on its vast scale. It's a powerful reminder that even brilliant adaptive engineering can be overwhelmed by climate shifts outside the range it was designed to handle.
Right, but the success of modern revivals proves the inherent sustainability of the Sukakwalu method itself under, let's say, normal conditions.
Exactly. The concept was sound.
Okay, now let's jump forward in time to the Inca Empire, and specifically that incredible site, Machu Picchu, built around 1450 AD. This is on a steep mountain ridge, a very different kind of extreme environment again.
Absolutely. Machu Picchu is perched precariously on this narrow ridge at about 2,400 meters, around 8,000 feet elevation. It faces several major water challenges. One, there's no large river nearby for easy supply.
Okay.
Two, it receives torrential rainfall up to 2 meters, that's over 6 feet annually. Three, it experiences a long, dry season. And critically, building on such steep, saturated slopes carries a huge risk of landslides.
A lot to deal with. So the first challenge was simply getting water to the site in the first place. How'd they manage that?
It was classic Inca ingenuity. They located a natural spring high up on the mountain, roughly 750 meters away from the main urban area. They captured the spring water in a stone-lined catchment area and then built a precisely engineered stone channel, basically an aqueduct, to carry the water downhill to the city.
750 meters of hand-built stone channel on a mountain slope. How did they ensure it worked reliably without, like, modern surveying tools?
The aqueduct channel was relatively small, about 15 centimeters, 6 inches wide, and 16 centimeters deep. But its construction was meticulous. It was built with carefully fitted stones, sometimes cut directly into the bedrock, and laid with a remarkably consistent, gentle slope of about 3%.
3%. That's specific.
Yeah, that precise gradient was critical. It allowed the water to flow smoothly and reliably by gravity without moving so fast it would erode the channel or become unmanageable when it reached the city.
And where did the water go once it reached Machu Picchu?
It fed a series of 16 beautifully crafted fountains, or maybe ritual baths, cascading down the main axis of the urban sector. These were tiered stone basins with spouts, providing accessible fresh water for the inhabitants.
And there was a social aspect to the layout.
It seems so. The highest fountain, which offered the purest water first, was located near the residence believed to belong to the emperor or the supreme ruler. It subtly integrated social hierarchy right into the water distribution system.
They also built in impressive safety features, didn't they, for overflows?
They showed incredible foresight. While the aqueduct was designed to handle the spring's normal flow rate, estimated at about 25 liters, maybe 6 to 7 gallons per minute, the channel and fountain system were actually engineered to accommodate much higher flows, perhaps up to 100 liters per minute.
Why so much extra capacity?
Well, that might occur during heavy rainfall events when runoff could add to the spring's flow. To manage any excess water, they built 2 expertly constructed overflow channels, essentially stone-lined spillways that acted as safety valves.
No.
Yeah. If the flow became too high, the surplus water would automatically be diverted away from the main urban core and directed down the mountain slope, often conveniently irrigating the agricultural terraces below. The sources also note that while the spring was the primary source, they built access paths way down to the Urubamba River far below, as a kind of difficult-to-reach backup plan in case of extreme drought.
But perhaps the most celebrated Inca engineering at Machu Picchu wasn't bringing water in, but dealing with the huge amount of water falling on the site, preventing those landslides you mentioned.
Absolutely. This is arguably their masterstroke of sustainable design. The main challenge was the risk of those steep, unstable slopes becoming waterlogged from the torrential rains, leading to catastrophic landslides.
So what was the solution?
Their brilliant solution was the construction of over 700 agricultural terraces across the site, not just for farming, but primarily as a massive integrated drainage system.
The terraces themselves were drainage. How did that work?
The key is in their subsurface construction. Each terrace platform wasn't just dirt piled behind a stone wall. It was a carefully engineered cross-section of layered materials.
Layers?
Yeah. The base, directly above the bedrock, was filled with large, coarse crushed rock. Above that came layers of smaller gravel, then sand, and finally a relatively thin layer of topsoil for cultivation.
Ah, okay. So rainwater would just filter right down through all those layers.
Precisely. This multi-layered construction created a highly permeable structure. Rainwater hitting the terrace surface would quickly percolate down through the soil, sand, and gravel, then flow through the coarse rock layer to the edge of the terrace, or maybe get intercepted by internal drainage shafts and directed safely away.
So it stopped the soil getting waterlogged.
Exactly. It prevented water from accumulating in the soil and saturating the slope, effectively turning the entire terraced hillside into a giant, efficient drainage sponge. The stone walls themselves were also often built with a slight inward tilt to counter outward pressure and promote stability, and gaps deliberately left between stones allowed for additional drainage.
And they used this approach even under the buildings in the main city area.
Yes, the same principle was applied to the urban sector. The foundations of important structures were built on deep fills of porous, crushed stone, acting like French drains to keep water away from the building foundations. Stone-lined drains and culverts were integrated into the walkways and plazas throughout the city to collect surface runoff and direct it safely down the mountain via the terrace system.
The effectiveness of this is pretty obvious, given that the site is still standing after centuries of those torrential rains.
It's an absolute testament to their engineering genius and foresight. Modern engineers who study Machu Picchu just marvel at how well this integrated system, aqueduct, fountains, terraces, urban drains, manages rainwater. It allowed the site to remain stable on a naturally unstable slope for over 500 years, with remarkably few major issues related to landslides or erosion.
This wasn't just like adding infrastructure later. It sounds like they planned the city and the landscape as one integrated system right from the start.
Absolutely. The sources emphasize that the water system, the aqueduct path, the fountain locations, and critically, the layout and subsurface engineering of the terraces and urban drains was planned before, or at least concurrently with the construction of the city itself. The urban design and the water management were inextricably linked from the beginning.
And they achieved all this with incredibly precise stonework and an understanding of gravity, without pumps or metal pipes like those Egyptian copper ones.
Their mastery of stone was just unparalleled. They carved bedrock, they shaped and fitted massive stones together with incredible precision, often without mortar, yet achieving water tightness or structural stability, sometimes using clay for seals and conduits. And they clearly understood how to manage water flow under pressure, which we see evidence of at other Inca sites like Tipon near Cusco, where water is channeled through carefully engineered stone conduits, creating fountains with consistent pressure. Their engineering was deeply rooted in their knowledge of local materials and the specific demands of the Andean environment.
Okay, comparing the scale and complexity of these Andean examples to the others we've discussed.
Right. Tiwanaku operated on a regional scale, transforming hundreds of square kilometers with their agricultural system while also managing urban water and waste. The Inca Empire, of course, undertook massive infrastructure projects across their territory, but at a specific site like Machu Picchu, the scale is smaller. It's a single, relatively self-contained mountain settlement.
But the complexity at Machu Picchu sounds incredibly high.
It is, especially in terms of integration. Water supply, distribution via those cascading fountains, which is a form of controlled flow, massive scale drainage via engineered terraces, and urban drainage are all part of one interlocking design. Tiwanaku's blend of ecological and hydraulic engineering in their raised fields and their urban sewer system were also remarkably complex and unique for the region. Both demonstrate a deep understanding of local environmental challenges and how to use available materials, earth, stone, water itself, in really sophisticated ways.
And their sustainability and legacy. How did these systems hold up?
Both systems show remarkable sustainability when conditions were within the normal range they were designed for. Tiwanaku's raised fields were highly productive and resilient to frost for centuries, but ultimately vulnerable to that prolonged extreme drought.
Right.
The Inca terraces at Machu Picchu were designed for incredible resilience against erosion and landslides, ensuring the stability of the site itself. And many similar terraces across the Inca heartland are still farmed today, demonstrating their agricultural sustainability. Machu Picchu's infrastructure survived its abandonment largely due to the excellence of its design.
And while they weren't in contact with old world civilizations, their techniques are actually influencing us today, aren't they?
Yes, increasingly so. The study of Tiwanaku's raised fields has inspired modern efforts in high-altitude agricultural development and frost mitigation techniques. Inca terrace systems are studied by agronomists and engineers for lessons in soil conservation, erosion control, and building resilient infrastructure on steep slope, essentially, sustainable design in challenging environments. Their water features at places like Machu Picchu aren't just historical marvels, they're case studies in how to manage water precisely using only gravity and local materials.
Connecting this back to you one last time, think about trying to build anything on a difficult mountain ridge today, especially with the increasing intensity of rainfall we're seeing. How did these ancient Andean engineers achieve such complex, integrated, and resilient water management systems using just stone, earth, and a profound understanding of their environment? It makes you reconsider what's truly necessary for robust, long-lasting infrastructure.
So let's try to bring all this together now, connect it to the bigger picture. Looking across these four vastly different civilizations, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, ancient Egypt, and the pre-Columbian Andes, what were the core similarities in how they approached water engineering? What did they all have in common?
Well, the sources make it really clear that in every single case, water was recognized as absolutely fundamental. Fundamental to their ability to sustain complex, settled societies and large populations.
Right, job one, basically.
Though consequently, they all made massive investments in labor, resources, and social organization to manage it on a significant scale.
And across the board, you see the creation or modification of waterways, primarily canals of some kind, to direct water for agriculture and in some cases for urban supply. That's a common thread.
They also all developed systems, though with different goals and scales, for dealing with excess water, whether it was draining flood basins in Egypt, managing stormwater and wastewater in Indus and Tiwanaku cities, controlling erratic river floods in Mesopotamia, or preventing landslides from torrential rain at Machu Picchu. Drainage was key.
And crucially, in every single one of these examples, the scale and complexity of their water infrastructure necessitated significant social organization and coordination. You needed state power, like in Egypt, or maybe the Inca.
Or temple authority, like
Yeah.
Mesopotamia.
Right, or municipal bodies, like we suspect in the Indus and Tiwanaku, or maybe just strong communal organization. But you needed something to build, maintain, and manage access to these vital shared resources. It couldn't be just individuals.
And despite the differences in environment and technology, they all demonstrated a fundamental understanding of gravity flow, how to design channels and systems to make water go where they needed it, just using the natural slope of the land. And they were incredibly ingenious in their use of local materials: mud brick in Mesopotamia and the Indus, stone in the Andes in Egypt, earthworks everywhere, making do with what they had.
Exactly. Now, the key differences are just as revealing, right? Showing how environment and maybe cultural priorities shaped their specific paths.
Yeah, one major divergence seems to be the primary focus of their largest-scale water efforts. Mesopotamia and Egypt, they dedicated immense resources to those vast regional agricultural irrigation systems, transforming entire river valleys mainly to maximize food production.
Whereas the Indus Valley and the Andean cultures, while they certainly cared about agriculture, they also placed a much higher priority, it seems, and invested significant engineering effort into urban water supply, distribution, and especially those sophisticated sanitation systems within their cities.
Right, those early true covered urban sewer networks in the Indus and Tiwanaku. That's a major point of distinction from Egypt and early Mesopotamia, which didn't really have that citywide focus.
A clear difference in whether the biggest engineering marvel was out in the fields or under the city streets.
Exactly, and in terms of technological complexity.
Well, the sources suggest the Indus and Andean systems often show more intricate engineering in those urban contexts. Things like standardized components, precise gradients for wastewater flow, complex layering for drainage, maybe even those pressurized conduits in the Andes.
Right.
Egypt's and Mesopotamia's strength was maybe more in managing massive volumes and coordinating systems over vast linear distances, using simpler technical means, relying more heavily on that administrative complexity we talked about.
The environment clearly dictated the most pressing problems they had to solve, too.
Absolutely. The arid, flood-prone environments of Mesopotamia and Egypt demanded systems to get water to the land reliably. The monsoon climate of the Indus and the torrential rains and unstable slopes of the Andes demanded sophisticated drainage and runoff management to make urban life and agriculture even possible. And Tiwanaku faced that unique challenge of frost, solved by cleverly leveraging water's thermal properties.
And their different environments led to different long-term sustainability challenges.
Yeah. Mesopotamia faced that long-term human-induced problem of salinization. The Indus, their decline seems more tied to external climate shifts, maybe monsoon failure. Egypt's system was remarkably sustainable for millennia thanks to the Nile's natural renewal cycle, but vulnerable to unpredictable low floods. And the Andean systems, while resilient in many ways, were ultimately sensitive to extreme, prolonged climate variability like severe drought. Each faced a distinct challenge to its long-term viability.
And finally, the sources touch a bit on how water integrated with their cultural and spiritual lives differently.
Right. For Egypt, the Nile flood was sacred, tied to deities and cosmology, reflected in rituals and monumental architecture like those temple lakes. In the Andes, water sources like springs and mountains were often venerated, and features like the cascading fountains at Machu Picchu likely held ritual as well as practical significance. In Mesopotamia and the Indus, while water was certainly tied to religious beliefs, the engineering descriptions in the sources tend to emphasize the pragmatic, the utilitarian, and the regulatory aspects maybe a bit more strongly.
So synthesizing all this, it's just remarkable to see both the universal need for water management driving similar basic solutions like canals and drains, and then the incredible diversity of complex innovations that developed in response to wildly different environments and priorities.
It really shows the adaptive genius of human societies. They engineered systems perfectly suited to their unique challenges, ranging in scale from vast imperial systems down to incredibly integrated site-specific designs like Machu Picchu. And the longevity and success of these systems were often deeply linked to how well they understood, respected, and worked within the specific environmental context they inhabited.
These ancient engineers, working with what seemed to us like pretty basic tools, they really laid the groundwork for so much of our modern water infrastructure and management principles.
They truly did. Their enduring legacy isn't just in the ruins we can visit, fascinating as they are. It's in the fundamental problems they identified and the diverse solutions they invented, solutions that are, frankly, increasingly relevant today as we grapple with water scarcity, climate change, and the urgent need to build truly sustainable and resilient water systems for a growing global population.
So what does this all mean? We've taken a pretty deep dive into how four ancient civilizations, separated by geography and time, each developed incredibly sophisticated ways to manage water. They mastered challenges ranging from transforming arid plains with vast irrigation, creating groundbreaking urban sanitation networks, harnessing the predictable pulse of a mighty river, to building resilient, integrated systems in the face of extreme mountain environments, frost, and torrential rain.
And their achievements were far more than just impressive construction projects, weren't they? They required deep environmental understanding, complex social organization, meticulous planning, and a profound recognition that water wasn't just a resource, but the very foundation of life and society. Engineering water was absolutely essential to sustaining that life, often for thousands of years.
Connecting this to you listening now. It's truly awe-inspiring to realize that with relatively simple materials, earth, brick, stone, but armed with deep knowledge and immense collective effort, these ancient peoples built water systems that sustained populations for millennia. It really forces us to reflect on our own highly technological, energy-intensive water infrastructure today and ask some hard questions about its long-term sustainability and resilience.
Yeah. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, considering the diverse water challenges these ancient engineers faced, Mesopotamia's struggle with salinization, the Indus's pioneering urban waste management, Egypt's symbiotic relationship with the Nile, Andean ingenuity adapting to drought, frost, landslides, which of their fundamental approaches, or perhaps even some forgotten techniques, do you think offers the most valuable lessons, or holds the most potential for helping us build more resilient and sustainable water systems in our increasingly challenged world today?
That's definitely something to mull over,
Mm.
maybe as you think about where your own water comes from.